Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English 2105, British literature from its earliest beginnings to 1700. Today, we are going to continue our discussion of Shakespeare. So we're going to finish our discussion of Shakespeare's sonnets, and we're going to begin our discussion of Shakespeare's drama by looking at an introduction to his dramatic form, generally speaking, which should serve us well as we enter a discussion next week of Antony and Cleopatra, one of his great tragedies. Before we begin that discussion, just a reminder, tomorrow you have your research essay due. We've discussed it a couple of times, and I just want to check now if there are any questions before we begin the lecture on Shakespeare. Any questions on the essay due tomorrow? You can indicate that in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay. As by show of hands, who's started the essay already? Has maybe started drafting or started an outline or something? Okay, so we have some thumbs up there. That's good. That's good. Yep. So yeah, that's always it's good to get started as early as possible. I have to say, you know, I say that now, but I have to admit, when I was in undergrad, there were many times I was doing the proverbial all-nighter before it was due. So I do sympathize with your plight if you are in that boat. I have a question from Riley. Do you want to unmute and say it aloud for everyone so people don't get bored of just my voice?
Yeah, hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. I was just wondering if for the essay, it's required for footnotes or endnotes, or do you just need like a bibliography at the end for the secondary resources that we cite?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad you posed it here, because I'm sure a lot of people have that question. So so I'm not going to be really stickly about the format. I would encourage you to use what's called the MLA format, and in the instructions for the assignment that are in the syllabus, there's a link to the English Department Style Guide, and there's some guidance there for how to use what's called their parenthetical documentation. So you say, or citation of a source. So you would kind of refer to the last name of the author and the year if necessary, and then comma, page number, end of parentheses. So parentheses, you know, brackets, okay? And then you'd have a works cited at the end that would list those authors in alphabetical order, okay? But I'm not going to be real stickler around, you know, making sure, oh, well, you didn't put the colon in the right place in that citation. So as long as it's fairly intuitive to whom you're referring throughout the essay, that'd be great.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? That's a good one I often get. The other one I got from a few people via email was how to cite my, if they wanted to cite the lecture notes. So there, again, just use me as author and then put kind of the title of the course and the title of the lecture as the work, and I think that's good for a citation. Other questions, either on the kind of the mechanics or general guidance on the essay? Good. So without further ado, let's return to our discussion of Shakespeare's sonnets. So we have, so the last time we discussed, the last two lectures, we've been discussing these kind of a unique literary expression or explosion of these love lyrics. sonnets. Remember we mentioned, love, it's not really a real big theme in the mead hall of the old English literary authors. They weren't talking about wooing some mates there. They were talking about battles and what have you, and quite a different topic of discussion. And a little bit more in the Middle Ages, we see this in we didn't really read a lot of it directly, but romances, as part of a knightly quest. There's question of the knight's duty to some sort of unattainable lady of court, so to speak. And there's from these tropes that we get the courtly love tradition, and then that contributed to some of the early love poetry in the Renaissance. So that's kind of the background. We looked at different ways in which this kind of enduring human experience of needing to find companionship with another human. It's as I said, there's seems to be a certain natural element to that it pervades across all cultures, all times, that humans do this sort of mating, and obviously with different cultural and conventional twists. And maybe the desire to be with the other mate has different kind of durations of for life, for the evening, what have you. But along with that kind of enduring natural element, what we see are different ways in which kind of a cultural meaning can be drawn from that experience, or how that experience is articulated and brought to light through different both cultural practices, but through different art, literature, and means of expression. Okay, so what we see in the Renaissance is a particularly powerful combination of physical and spiritual veneration of love as an ultimate human experience, and probably not really equal, at least in terms of literary output. Like maybe today maybe we see a kind of a veneration of it in different media, film, television shows, the rom-coms, the romantic comedies, those types of things do venerate it as the whole goal, let's say, of that narrative arc. And we saw that in a couple of examples. We saw Sidney's treatment of the conventions and pointing to kind of the limits of the existing conventions he was working in. And we saw Spenser build on that and point to another alternative, let us say, to the conventions where let's say a monogamous married relationship could be the goal, and it could be kind of a human, two humans and not just two types, so to speak, that grow together in time, in a real married relationship where there's give and take and those types of things, and that's new, let us say, at the time, and that's a new way of expressing it, and beautiful, and there's something for us to, let's say, learn from that, or there's something hopefully for us to read that and think about maybe our own experiences in a new light. Then Shakespeare kind of opens up the variety, the infinite variety. We'll see that term that's used about Cleopatra. Next week we'll see that term. Shakespeare opens up, let's say, an infinite variety of possible ways in which beyond the conventions and beyond kind of the married relationship, love can occur, and kind of different emotional moods that happen within those types of relationships. So we haven't had a chance to go through all the sonnets, but we've got a sample of one where in the first part of the sonnets, directed to the young man, there's question around love and how, let's say, the poet speaker's experience of love for the young man expresses itself in a desire to somehow eternize, make eternal, or think of ways in which the young man could become eternal and transcend in some way the devouring jaws of time, and avoid, let's say, the scythe of time that harvests all things. We saw in the discussion of that in the procreation sonnets that the solution moved from, let's say, procreation, seeing the possibility of transcending time through one's offspring, to maybe as the procreation sonnets progressed, an increasing recognition that this procreation is maybe little more than bestial breeding, as it's referred to in Sonnet 12. We see at first in Sonnet 15 an allusion to another alternative of becoming eternal through potentially the craft and the art of the poet. And then finally, that alternative, I would say, gets kind of a triumphant celebration, the eternal lines to time that are described in Sonnet 18. So we won't, we'll leave that there in terms of our discussion of the young man. Before we leave Shakespeare's sonnets, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Dark Lady. So we'll look at the Dark Lady sonnets, which are the last from 127. So the sonnet sequence is about, if I recall correctly, 154 sonnets in Shakespeare's case. So from sonnet 127 to 152 seem to be directed to this, to a relationship the poet speaker has with a quote unquote dark lady. So she has, say, darker complexion, dark hair, and these aspects of her appearance are highlighted several times. Also want to indicate, first of all, I'm not sure if I underscored this last time, is Shakespeare's sonnets, when it comes to, let's say, lyric poetry, are often underscored as perhaps, at least in the English language, kind of the epitome of that art form. So obviously, when it comes to drama, there's probably a short list of his dramatic works that people point to as must reads or must sees in terms of there's the big four tragedies: Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, and in terms of lyric, so short non-narrative poetry, then we would point to the sonnets as kind of your must read, before you die. And then we'll close off the course with Paradise Lost, which, when it comes to epic or long narrative poetry, then at least in the English language, this is far and away seen as the greatest single work. So I just want to underscore, let's say, the importance of the sonnets within the literary tradition of lyric, as a real touchstone that other authors, the tradition itself, seem kind of refer back to. So the Dark Lady, now, first of all, as I said, the lady in this sequence of sonnets is referred to as having these dark features, and it's seen as described as paradoxical because within the traditional conventions of describing beauty at the time, there was this connection between something being fair, let's say, so bright, and beauty shining in what is light and beautiful, let's say beautiful in the sense of bright and shining, as opposed to dark. Okay, so so that paradox is highlighted by Shakespeare. So Shakespeare wants to highlight, again, against the conventions. So the idea is that we don't want our experience to be clouded by some sort of convention that can block us from seeing the beauty in what would otherwise be overlooked. And this begins even in the sonnets devoted to the youth. So in sonnets 63 and 65, which are in the young man's section, they deal with the image of poetry, which is, let's say, written in black ink. So where beauty paradoxically shines forth through something that's black. Okay, so beauty is always described as something that shines forth, and this shining is like a beacon that draws the soul. Okay, so think of, let's say, and the metaphor is a bit mixed because I was thinking of a lighthouse and a boat, but the lighthouse is kind of warning the boat to stay away from the shore there, or the rocks that the lighthouse is warning about. But think of this light being a beacon that the soul is drawn toward. And so beauty throughout the tradition is described in these ways. And the paradox that Shakespeare points out even early on, even when not talking about the Dark Lady, but talking about the dark lines of poetry, is that beauty paradoxically is shining through what is black. Like the absence of light is letting show forth something that is light. So this kind of connects poetry to the Dark Lady early on, even before we start describing her. And we see this kind of defiance of convention also kind of arise in the denial of conventional comparison. So there's a couple of sonnets there. Well, first of all, there's this sonnet 18 that we read. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? The implied answer is no. So the comparisons don't work. So the traditional comparisons don't work. And then there's sonnet 130. I won't call it up, but I'll just maybe read a few lines of it. So sonnet 130 goes using, I don't know if you can see this, I mean, using, this is the New Cambridge version of Shakespeare's sonnet. So I gave a link, obviously, to free versions that are online, but if you ever want to own a text version, I find this a very good one. It has a lot of good scholarly apparatus. So scholarly apparatus refers to, let's say, the notes, the introduction, the different, let's say, interpretive matter for in appendices that are added to aid the reader sort through, let's say, some of the various scholarly interpretations of various parts of the work. So it's a good point of departure for those types of things as you move along. If you're studying literature later in your undergraduate career, looking for those types of works that have good scholarly apparatus provide a good point of departure for your next research essay, let's say, on that. So in sonnet 130, he starts with, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. So so my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. So normally, you know, I guess in the convention could be, oh, you know, my mistress' eyes, they shine like the sun, or as the sun shines, so my mistress' eyes. So through simile there, so through comparison using like or as, the comparison of the love object to, let's say, the sun or the moon, and we saw that in Sydney, to other phenomena in nature. Here they are nothing like the sun. It's nothing like the sun. It's if snow be white, then her breasts are done. If snow is white, then my mistress' breasts are not snow white, or they're not like a lily. They're done. They're beige or gray. If hairs be wires, then black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. So there's so these are convention, you know, saying that it's like there's roses in her cheeks as she blushes, these types of things. So this eschewal of conventional comparisons means, and then I'll just go to the punchline here. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground, and yet by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So I think my love as rare as any she belied, i.e. falsified with false compare. Okay, so these false comparisons don't allow the true beauty of that individual to appear. Okay, so they falsify it. They put over this kind of conventional sheen that doesn't make it real. Okay, so I think this is something of what's going on there, and it's something of this kind of paradox of letting the beauty of the black lines, let's say the poetic line, as well as the dark hair and complexion of the beloved show forth in the Dark Lady sonnets. So I forgot to mention, as the slide here indicates, there's been a lot of speculation, as there was with this, as I mentioned, with the young man. Some people trying to speculate, is this a person that Shakespeare knew? Who is that person? Did Shakespeare have some sort of same-sex relationship with this other man? And so trying to isolate the identity and some sort of biographical connection that connects Shakespeare in life to that person. So and again, there's no scholarly confirmation of any of these hypotheses. And the same with this one here, Mary Fitton as someone posited as potentially the Dark Lady. Again, not confirmed by any evidence that I've seen, at least. So I think it's better just to think of this as a kind of a poetic voice and kind of a fictional poetic device for talking about possibilities of love relationships. The positive view of the Dark Lady is not always presented. So the poet speaker oscillates much like Astrophil. There's a lot of similarities, let's say, in Astrophil and Stella to the very fickle voice that you see in these Dark Lady sonnets. I would assert. So the speaker in these sonnets will talk about darkness being symbolized with moral perversion instead of virtue, and that some of this comes to the fore in some of the sonnets. In some ways, the Dark Lady becomes a scapegoat for, let's say, time and the fallen world, and in some ways, the lady herself becomes kind of to blame for the physical nature of love and lust, what have you. And then, as with Sydney, as I mentioned, Astrophil has these kind of oscillations in terms of his relationship to Stella. So to here, the speaker in relation to the Dark Lady has these oscillations, and then there seem to be a few sonnets that highlight the fact that this oscillation, this fickleness, is in the perspective of the speaker, not necessarily in the object of desire. Okay, but as I said, often the blame is transferred to the object of desire. So 129 is a good example of that in my estimation. So one of the famous sonnets there. So I'll just read it and then we'll try to parse it out there a bit. The expensive spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action. And till action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner but despised straight. Past reason hunted and no sooner had, past reason hated as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit and in procession so, had, having, and in quest to have extreme, a bliss in proof and proved a very woe, before a dream proposed behind a dream. Before a joy proposed behind a dream. All this the world well knows, yet none knows well to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. So let's say the subject of this entire sonnet is lust. Okay, so the expensive spirit in a waste of shame is lust in action. So if we were to put that in normal, let's say normal word order, it would be lust in action is the expensive spirit in waste of shame. And lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame. Lust is no sooner enjoyed, but despised right away. Lust is past reason hunted. So the action of lust is past reason hunted. We seek after it, and then as soon as you have it, no sooner had, then it's past reason hated. Then it's irrationally despised afterward. Like, oh, why did I do that? As a swallowed bait, as in, oh boy, how did I get enticed into that? On purpose laid. So it's looked at afterwards as a swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker, the person, mad. It drives one to madness in the pursuit and in the possession of the actual lust in action. Had, having, and in quest to have extreme. Look at the order there. So had, having, and in quest to have extreme. So it's kind of a reversal of the temporal order. So had, it's already had, it's something that happened in the past. Having, like the actual moment of lust, and in quest to have, so before the actual lust, so looking at it in the future, it's something that you're searching after. In all of these moments, it's extreme, a bliss in proof. In the experience, it's a bliss, and proved, like afterwards, it's a woe. So you go, oh boy, why did I do that? I should have been more temperate there. I shouldn't have had those relations with, whether someone who's unattainable, taken, whatever reason. Before a joy proposed behind a dream. So before it happens, it's a joy, and then afterwards it's seen as a dream in the sense of not having substantial existence. Why did I put everything in? Why did I invest so much in something that was worth so little? All this the world well knows. So we kind of know it rationally. If you think about it, people know that this seeking after lustful action is not the be all and end all, so to speak. Yet none knows well, but no one knows to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. So, but still, people don't shun the heaven that lead them to this hell. So a few things there, I guess. So that's kind of, I guess, a paraphrase of it. In terms of the speaker's perspective on the action, like lustful action, so the sex act, so to speak, he's tainted by he expresses the very madness that he's decrying here. So it's not as though he's speaking from a point of rational detachment from it, like, oh, that's insane. I'm rationally detached from it, because in calling it, let's say, a hell, in calling it all of these things, he's basically manifesting what's described in line 4 and 5 there. It's savage, it's extreme, it's rude, it's cruel. not to trust. It's no sooner enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight. So he's despising, he's showing this kind of revulsion against it that one expects from the satisfied lover, so to speak, the satisfied lover he describes here. So earlier or in other sonnets, he'll have the pre-side. He'll be describing the beauty of his dark lady and desiring her, and maybe that's irrational, right? Just like here, it's past reason hunted. So that's line 6, right? Past reason. So it's irrationally hunted after, and no sooner had, but it's irrationally hated. So this is line 7. So past reason hated as a swallowed bait. So what we get here is not, as I said, this objective, cold realization that we as readers, I think, should take as 100% accurate, that the sex act and trying to search after it and what have you is irrational. All we get is, if we're to take this as true, we have to see it as tainted, as an irrational statement on sex by someone who is past reason hating the act that they just partook in. Just as, and similarly, we'll have to look at the other sonnets and say, well, these are also examples of the speaker irrationally searching after that which we know in just a couple sonnets later he's going to disparage. Okay, so much as we saw with Sidney's Astrophel and Stella, the sonnet itself, when thought about, let's say the perspective articulated within the sonnet, calls into question the speaker, okay, if we're to take them to their logical conclusion. Also want to highlight here some of the poetic figures that are kind of, well, one major poetic figure that has kind of two terms depending how it's defined, that highlights the flip-flopping that occurs in the mind of the lustful speaker of sonnet 129. So anti-metapole, which is means in Greek opposite change. So anti, opposite, metabolism, is changing something from one state to another. So it's an opposite change, anti-metabole, which means literally, when it comes to rhetoric or poetry, the repetition of certain words in successive clauses, but in reversed order. So it's often associated with this term called chiasmus, after the Greek letter chi. And I tried to put an image there on the right of the Greek letter chi. So the Greek letter chi, or chiasmus, can be a term for what happens in one poetic line where terms are reversed. So is lust in action, and after action, lust. So lust in action, so lust, action, action, lust. So same terms, but reversed order. So that can be a symbol for this chiasmus, because, as the chiasmus goes, what came first on the right-hand side is last, and what was last on the next is first. So it kind of mirrors that reversing of the actual chiasmus. On a poetic line, a chiasmus is an important poetic device, but also in terms of the overall structure of a poetic, often poetic works, but also prose works. A larger structure of poetry or prose can have a chiastic structure, it's called. So it can have this structure where, and this is kind of outlined here. So works that have this, for instance, well, a lot of biblical texts have this chiastic structure. So Hebrew literature has this chiastic structure. Whether it's, let's say, in the Abrahamic saga of different narrative tales, or through a whole book in the Bible, or through a subsection within one chapter. So what will happen at the beginning, so you'll have a couple of events or key things. So sorry, Hebrew Bible, Plato's Republic, and a lot of Plato's dialogues have this. Augustine's Confessions, you know, and there's, especially in classical literature, chiastic structure is in a large majority of these works. They'll be structured around this. So what does it mean? What does it mean to have these works in a chiastic structure? Is, well, there'll be either a theme, a topic, or an event talked about in section, like a first section, slightly different theme, topic, or event, and then that can be labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, let's say. So a theme, topic, or event happens in the first half, a series of these. We get to kind of a central fulcrum, here labeled F, which is the center, and usually the center has the kind of most essential and hidden part that may have a hidden meaning. And then you have a repetition, but in reversed order, and with a new light on this, of those events or topics. So in the Republic, you have a beginning with a description of Socrates going down, recounting how he went down to the Piraeus. So it's and it's metaphorically a descent into the underworld. They went down to the river, to the land across the river, to the Piraeus, and it's metaphorically this descent into the underworld, like Odysseus. And he describes through the next sections a successive, let's say, building of an ideal city in speech. So they try to hypothesize in the Republic what would make the ideal city. So that progresses up from these different types of cities. In the center, we have this description of similes of the divided line, of the allegory of the cave, and we have almost the brightest light of the sun in the center. So both in terms of the topics and the images, you go from an underworld to the brightest light, so to speak. And then you have, so that would be F, right? So here the center is this allegory of the cave. Then you have this descent through what he calls the destruction of cities. So this is what happens to the best city. First it's, you know, it's an aristocracy, but then it becomes an oligarchy and a democracy. Honor, rule by honor, then oligarchy, rule by greed and wealth, and then democracy, and then finally tyranny. And then he describes a myth of which is again a descent into the underworld after death. So kind of mirroring again this descent into the underworld, and opposite extreme from ascending out of the cave. It's again in the underneath the ground in the cave. So both in terms of topics and images, we have this kind of repetition in reverse order. So we have chiastic structures in individual poetic lines and as an ordering structure for many classic literary works. Now, why is it important when it comes to, well, for either, let's say what's happening, one way of looking at it is, and why it might be important, let's say, in biblical literature is it's a way in which the literary structure mirrors the spiritual experience it's trying to describe. So let's say the chiastic structure shows that what has changed is a reversal of one's perspective on the world. So a conversion experience is literally a turning around, and this is what happens in the allegory of the cave as well, right? So for those of you who've read this, is a prisoner is in the cave. So in Plato, as in the Hebrew Bible, we have experiences of conversion that become the fulcrum of a chiastic structure that make that make us see the events or return to the events in a new way. So return to our life in a new way. So let's say a topic returns, but in a new light, okay? Or an event occurs, but maybe the event occurs with a different outcome, okay? So if it's a topic, the topic returns with a different aspect or almost opposite aspect. If it's an event, it returns to a similar event but with a different outcome. So too on the poetic line, we have something that's described twice, but from a reversed aspect. So we get in one line this kind of notion of a flip-flopping. So as I said, for in the Hebrew Bible and Plato, it's about a spiritual conversion that's positive. But here it's used for Shakespeare and some other instances when used as this poetic device, maybe for let us say kind of a fickle perspective, shifting perspectives on the same thing. So let's look at where that it happens a few times. That hopefully I can jotted them down somewhere. Which lines? Yeah. So yeah. So lust in action and till action lust. So so line 2. A bliss in proof and proved a very woe. So proof improved, bliss, and the opposite there is woe. All this the world well knows, but none knows well. So here, this this repetition of that kind of device of antimetabole or chiasmus contributes to this notion of, I think, of seeing things one way, like before. In this case, there's the description of the experience of anticipating the act of sexual consummation, and it's looked at one way. And then after the act, it's looked at the exact opposite way. So, and that's mirrored in the language, in the poetic language used. So it's mirrored in the poetic device of reversing the terms before and after in one line. So lust in action is one way of looking at that. And then before action, lust, or till action, lust. So reversed way after the fact. So a good example, as I said, of the poetic language kind of mirror, the poetic form mirroring and amplifying the content or the idea. Okay, that's where I want to close the discussion of Shakespeare's sonnets today. I'm going to pause for a second and ask if there's any questions on Shakespeare's sonnets before we move on. Okay. So as I said, we've looked at a couple of for a couple of lectures. We've looked at different forms of love lyrics. So that's a particular broad set of genre. So there's kind of grosso modo. There's prose, poetry, drama as depending how you slice it, either a type of poetry or separate large category of genre altogether. Within poetry, we can have long narrative poetry, so epic and other like ballads and what have you. And then there's lyrics, which are short. Narrative is not necessarily a big part of it. It's more about a short description of kind of one event, or one short description of one experience, one feeling, one moment. And sonnet, and within that, love sonnets, Renaissance love sonnets, would be one subgenre of that. We're going to move from that description, that genre, and that particular subset of genre, to another quite different genre of drama, which I'm sure you've come across in other in high school or other courses. Shakespeare's drama. Can I get a show of hands? Anyone, like before this course, has anyone read Antony and Cleopatra, Show of hands. Before this course, did anyone read that play? No one has read Antony and Cleopatra. That, at least that's online right now. Okay, so that's fine. I'm not totally surprised because it's not, let's say, one of the ones that are often taught in secondary school, or it would be taught definitely in a Shakespeare course. So people, let's say, I'm just, again, just to check previous knowledge, show of hands, who has read any play of Shakespeare's in another course or in high school? Okay, good. So a number of you, that's good. This is really intended, so even if you've read Shakespeare before, hopefully providing some sort of context around what to expect and to try to take, let's say, a bird's eye view about the universe Shakespeare creates. So he's probably universally considered the greatest author who ever lived. Okay, why is that? Okay, so in any language, so people point to Shakespeare. So what's going on there? What is created? So I want to say that there's an entire, let's say, universe that's created, a world of possibilities that's created there, a range of human experience that's covered and articulated in a way that's difficult to imagine anyone else being able to articulate. And part of that is understanding, first of all, just the layout of the types of drama that he created. Okay, so there's the lyric, so there's sonnets, and there's a few other lyrics he created. We looked at the sonnet, so that's kind of, even there we saw there was kind of a different explosion and multiplication of the variety of types and the complexity of the relationship that Shakespeare approached on that exercise, and that was something he just kind of threw off on the side. Then when it comes to the drama, which is what he's most known for, similarly, there are these strides that are being made in this work, on this body of work, in terms of the possibilities for expressing both, let's say, the narrative arc of the stories covered, the characters, the dimensions of expression possible, the dramatic world that's kind of created in the interaction. So the idea here is just to get a sense of the overlay of that. We won't be able to obviously go through and study each, or even take excerpts from each of his plays. There's at least 38 of them. So this is just kind of the lay of the land. So we'll talk a bit about theater in the time of Shakespeare. We'll talk a bit about, just make sure we know kind of the body of works that are part of this universe. And then try to get a sense of these genres. So I said it's drama, it's the larger genre, and then there's history, comedy, tragedy as the three major subgenres within there. And we'll talk a bit about that. Reminder of where we are. I put Shakespeare in this Jacobean age. He's kind of writing both the tail end of the Elizabethan age and the Jacobean age. So actually, if you are an English major at the University of Ottawa, they have our Shakespeare offering is offered in two slices. There's Elizabethan Shakespeare, so the plays written up to 1601, and then there's the Jacobean Shakespeare for 1603, and then there's the Jacobean Shakespeare for plays written from 1603 till his death in 1616, if memory serves. So the kind of a debate I don't want to get into really at all, because I don't think it helps us, is this authorship debate. I'll just say he's, by kind of the vast majority of scholars, the person that we have records on named William Shakespeare, that he was the author of the plays, is largely accepted based on the evidence. We do have quite a bit of evidence compared to other people, you know, let's say records of his life, let's say, compared to others at that time because of his various transactions, business transactions and work in the theater. There are still dissenting opinions on that. And as I said, I'm not sure how much farther it gets us. You know, it's not as though I would say through the plays we want to get to know who that person was, that individual. That's kind of what could be called, let's say, either the intentional fallacy or an overly emphasizing kind of a focus on getting to know the author via the works. Here, I think what we have is the text and the world and the context that we know about that is created when we interact with those works. So whether it's a person named William Shakespeare or kind of some Earl of Oxford who wrote it, I don't really care as much. Not everyone shares that perspective, but with barring further evidence, let's assume it was William Shakespeare. So here's this kind of a image from inside the new Globe Theatre, and just kind of get a sense here of so this would be closer to the kind of experience of the theater in 16th, 17th century England that Shakespeare's plays would have been produced on. See the raised stage, a pit or a yard with people standing around here closest to the stage. These are the cheapest seats in the house. These galleries, you pay a little bit more for these. You might have a better eye line on there, but here you're kind of more a real part of the spectacle. There can be entrances. So here's a possible entrance here in the yard. Sometimes it's indicated in the play text itself, entrance in the yard. So there's that kind of intimacy of the performance. So the raised stage means they have a space for what they called hell below here. So there's a trap door so characters can enter or descend into hell. So spirits can raise from below the trap door and represent kind of spirits from an underworld. We have heaven painted up here. So it represents a world. As Shakespeare refers to this, the wooden O that encompasses the globe, and that the fact that it's called the Globe Theatre is I think indicative as well. So the early modern stage is real kind of invention, you know, is real in terms of the birth of this art form is a significant event in itself. So it arose in England in the 16th century. So the first time, at least in the since Greece, really, since Greece and Rome, that there were a fixed stage with assigned places for an audience and professional theatrical companies to do performances. So before that, there were some plays in the Middle Ages, but the entire enterprise of putting on a play was more of an amateur exercise. It was centered around religious festivals often. It might be played on a movable wagon, so it could be sometimes they're called pageant plays. So they would have these pageant plays where different guilds in the communities would put on different excerpts of let's say the story of the Bible. So and so would do Cain and Abel and maybe the Adam and Eve story, and so they're covering off Genesis, the first parts of Genesis, and that's my guild, and we're doing this on a wagon. We present that part, and then our wagon moves along down the road to the next stop, the next community, and put on the show again, and the audience remains, and the wagon comes along, and the story of Tower of Babel maybe, and Abraham or what have you, or Exodus, the next book. after Genesis, maybe that's performed, and so forth. So these pageant plays, again, presented by amateurs, you know, my day job, I'm a blacksmith or something like that. And then, well, you know, on the weekend, you know, me and some buddies from the blacksmith shop, we got together and put on this play, and someone put together kind of this quick script. And we don't have a you know, a standing theater or anything like that. So I don't want to diminish it. You know, it's a great form of expression, etc. But it's considerably different from this conception of a fixed playhouse and professional players, let's say. The other aspect of let's say medieval drama was and it's also the case in the pageant plays, the mystery plays that I was describing, is the characters are two-dimensional. You're not getting to know these characters. They're not giving soliloquies where they express kind of inner thoughts. They are two-dimensional. So morality plays really underscore this. So morality play is you have a character named Everyman who is going through some trial or tribulation over a choice, let's say, and you have a character named Virtue and a character named Vice. And we saw a bit of this psychomachia, it's called. So psychomachia, psychos for soul, machia is struggle or conflict. So the psychomachia of that we saw a bit in Asheville and Stella, where there's this battle of virtue and love for Stella. So for the way in which Asheville will deal with Stella. Here it's virtue and vice for every man. And every man has to choose virtue, of course, and in the end he does. And virtue and vice, you're not expecting to have a soliloquy from Virtue or something that says, you know, I hate being goody two shoes all the time. You know, why I get pigeonholed in this. You know, I want to sometimes let loose, but expectations are on me all the time. I've got a job, you know, and I've got to do this, and it's a lot of pressure being Virtue. And then Vice coming along, you know, he's always on my back, you know, sometimes I want to be good, but he just makes me, you know what I mean? Like there would be kind of complex characters with different motivations, layers of kind of soul beneath that we need to unpack. Here, this is something that Shakespeare is really a pioneer in terms of the invention of a three-dimensional world in the theater, as well as a three-dimensional character, okay? So I have a comment here I just noticed, I'm not sure how long it's been there. Was this new use of theater a result of English Elizabethan church reform, possibly regarding what could be made into art outside of biblical characters? Definitely, yeah, I think it's a good point. Yeah, so a part of a long complex history. So both for Elizabethan or Tudor, let's say, reigning in of the power of the church, but even more broadly, the history of the Renaissance is one of exploring humanist themes. So themes that are of the human, not just as it relates to a biblical teaching. Going back to, remember we saw when we were talking about Chaucer, one of the causes way back was really the plague, really. You know, it's the plague, different forces that led to, when we talked about modernity, different forces that led us to question, not us, I guess, them to question the authority of the church when it came to questioning the ecclesiastical governance around that ultimately led to the Protestant Reformation. So there's a complex web of forces that are going on in the Renaissance that led to a general questioning of the authority of the church, questioning of to what extent can I study the stories of Athens? Remember Athens and Jerusalem in the battle of these two pillars behind the Western tradition. Can I look at the stories and the themes of the classics in a way that pertains to this world and this life, okay? As opposed to just a footnote to that's kind of like the story of Moses or something like that, right? So people can take that theme too far. It's not as though anyone was atheist at this time, right? Like everyone, well, not everyone, but a vast majority of people at this time were devout Christians, and they're not even questioning the truth of Christianity. What they're questioning is that relationship, let's say, of Athens and Jerusalem. To what extent can we look at this world for exploring stories that can be put on stage that will shed light on our experience? Looking at the stars, and maybe they don't, maybe they tell us a story different than what Ptolemy had told us in terms of a geocentric universe, etc. So kind of a long-winded answer, but a good point well taken, and totally agree. Yeah, was this new use of the theater, the original question, the result of church reform, and what could be made of art outside of biblical characters? Absolutely, yeah, as part of a larger Renaissance movement. Very good point. Thank you. So that's Ian. Any other comments or questions on, let's say, the rebirth of the theater that we see in Elizabethan England? So theater in the time of Shakespeare, we see the first real theater is 1576, just outside of London, to avoid city restrictions, and then followed closely by others, the Rose, the Swan, and then the Globe, which was built by the company to which Shakespeare belonged and had a partnership in. So and kind of maybe to emphasize a bit more the point I was trying to make earlier is, I think we could say that the Elizabethans were the first to create the first permanent stages and professional groups in England. So the stage is set, so to speak. And then Shakespeare is the first to create a world within that theater, and the first fully formed three-dimensional human characters within that world, with many dimensions, not just those two dimensions of virtue and vice. So there's a good book, I wouldn't say a great book, but it's a good book, by a famous critic who just, I think, passed away maybe a year ago or so, Harold Bloom, and it's called Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human. So the thesis there, so Harold Bloom's one of these people that is, books are sold in chapters, not just in the university bookstore. So he has a wide readership for many of his books, which is, kind of a popularization of a certain brand of scholarly reading of these works. So Harold Bloom is one of these kind of big late 20th century critics. And in this book, Shakespeare and the Invention of the Human, his point basically is that in creating these complex characters, these characters with interiority, that through a monologue we might learn about these different motives and kind of competing interests, and learn about kind of these competing and maybe complex emotions that are behind the actions and words of public characters. We get the first inklings that humans are these, let's say, three-dimensional, large, complex interior entities, as opposed to, let's say, manifestations of a social function. We had a bit of that in the estate satire of Chaucer. Like Chaucer wants to poke holes at the social facade and say that maybe they're not up to that, but it's not really it's not really a very complex three-dimensional thing. It's either the person is a virtuous knight, or maybe not, you know, and it doesn't offer a lot of alternative for room between, let's say, virtue and vice. You know, maybe you know, I think the indication there is either you're, to some extent, I don't want to overstate this point because Chaucer is definitely someone who's contributed to what Shakespeare's building here in terms of delving the human. But there is that sense of in the Middle Ages and definitely in works in the classical world, like Greece and Rome, that someone is their duty, is their function, is their and they're either virtuous in that pursuit or failing, what have you. So is Shakespeare the first to really create that way? Difficult to say, but is he, let's say, the most successful at articulating what our, let's say, modern notion of complex psyches and minds is? I would definitely put him on the short list and the top of a very, very short list of people who contributed to our modern understanding of human psyche and dimension. Just want to make sure we look at this kind of cross section of an Elizabethan theater again, and think about the consequences of it very quickly. So there's no theatrical scenery. So you need to put aside, here's kind of what I want to get across in this slide here, in this point, is put aside any experience that you have of theater, of like if you go to the National Art Center. I'm nothing against the National Art Center. I love the National Art Center, but I don't get there enough. You know, I've got 2 small kids and they don't want to go there. But when I was able to go, I would occasionally go with my wife, and we had a good time. So it's fine, but that's a different experience of theater than you would have had here. Okay, so there's no lighting, there's no setting. So what you have to get for any cue about where you are, when you are, what's happening, are words. The only thing to describe what's happening, where it's happening, when it's happening is the dialogue. Okay, super important. So a famous example from Twelfth Night is you know, Viola you know, entering on the scene there. What country friends is this? This is Illyria lady. You know, in film, in other manifestations of theater, there's a million different ways of indicating where one is without having to have it in the actual dialogue. Here, everything is in the actual script. Imagination is also crucial. So just a reminder, you probably know this, but boys until 1660 played the parts of women, and it was a convention borrowed from France at the time when it was brought in 1660. And a little note I find humorous is at the time there are people writing at the time that they were surprised at how well the women played women's part. So I just find that funny. Just how one's conception of what's natural gets fixed by something that's conventional, you know. So it's the open air theater, so no lights. You have to rely on daylight, right, to perform it. And it's communal, right? So what happens in a lot of modern theaters is you're inside, so it becomes pitch dark, and then there's lights on the stage, and then the audience is basically the audience becomes much like in watching a film. You know, it's pitch dark, and then you're this observer, detached observer, watching a spectacle that's removed from you, and your existence is kind of muted, and it's just this light on the object. Here, it's you know, you are part of this communal space, and you know, you're part of the action. Like I said, the entrances could be in the yard. It's popular, as I mentioned. I would sometimes go to the National Art Center, but what prevented it is it's super expensive. I don't know if anyone's tried to do this, but it's an expensive night out. and everybody's got their suits on, and or whatever, and dressing up because it's a real social affair, and it's kind of a bit of social posing, I would say. And then here, the exact opposite. So it's real. It's a popular form of entertainment. It's cheap. Everyone, especially the seats on the floor, it's a popular form of entertainment. So, Shakespeare at the time when he was writing would be closer to I always say Steven Spielberg, but does he still, like, I'm so detached from what happens now in popular art, in popular movies, but does he still make movies? But Shakespeare would be a let's say a very successful movie maker, let's say, in today's parallel of genres. Okay, so well, I guess really see, like, there's the Marvel hits there. So we have to remove all that to say we need to remove this sense that it was something that's done at the NAC, that you have to put your suit on for, and that it's only for this kind of reserved high culture versus low culture. Here, it was a popular form of entertainment that was, let's say, loved by the many. It had messages for the educated and erudite few, so as much as he's appealing to the many and trying to have jokes that will appeal to everyone, there are also going to be references to, let's say, classical tropes that will hook and also keep the interest of an educated few. And so it's a popular form that, let's say, became high culture later on, became adopted as high culture later on, as it became canonized, as it became part of a list of literary works that one has to read in one's lifetime. You have to read Shakespeare, you have to see Shakespeare's plays, and these are the greatest things. They become canonized as high culture, but at the time it was made, it was, let's say, popular culture. I guess it's kind of an interesting question. Now, what will be the genres, let's say, 200 years from now? Are there genres now that we're experiencing? Like I said, maybe it's film, maybe there are different forms of kind of, like Twitter novels or whatever I've seen that will be revered and seen as popular works now, that become canonized, that become part of something that's set aside as kind of the greatest expressions of a certain age, and that age's experience of, whether it's love or political commitment or political conflict, what have you. So Shakespeare's works. The other thing we have to remind ourselves is that Shakespeare, there's no master or original text. Okay, so we can't. The texts that we have are more like screenplays. Again, to use the film analogy, so the script is always in process. We don't have a master or original text that says, Shakespeare said, okay, I'm done writing Hamlet, and there it is. There's my final version of Hamlet, and off to the publisher. So when he's producing his scripts, they're scripts with they're often these what we have is no, let's say, one authorial written by the hand of Shakespeare version of Hamlet. We have prompt books, which would be, if I'm the actor for Claudius in Hamlet, I don't have the whole play written out because they're writing by hand, right? So it's a laborious exercise. So you say, okay, well, this is Claudius's prompt book. So Claudius just needs to know Claudius's lines and the prompt, i.e. the line that comes immediately before Claudius. Okay, so, okay, Gertrude's going to say that. Well, when she says that, I'll be ready to say this. Okay, so that's a prompt book. So people later on would publish Shakespeare's texts either from scrambling together prompt books or different versions of the script. So the other point I didn't make is that the script itself can evolve in the process of rehearsing the play, right? So an actor will say, oh, that doesn't make sense. Me doth want to be, I don't know, I'm not very good at that. I want to be at the front of the stage. I'll say this over here, you know. And so those lines can evolve. Okay, so again, using the film analogy, very similar to what you hear about happening on the set of film production. Okay, so someone just ad-libbed that line, we put that in, you know. Okay, so other ways in which we have remnants of Shakespeare's texts are what are called, well, let's say from different versions or different memory, okay? So someone went to see Hamlet. Now think, again, use the film analogy, think of bootlegs. So back in my day, people would go with like a video recorder, not anyone I know, but I'm told this would happen, and go into the theater and slouch down, I guess, and point this video camera at the movie so that they could go sell bootleg copies of the movie before it was, you know, released more widely, and make a little money. And of course, movie production companies frowned on this exercise because it's cutting into their revenue, right? So too here, maybe someone says, oh, okay, you know, Hamlet, it's being performed or was recently performed, and you know, why? So, okay, Hannah reassures me that people still make bootlegs today. Okay, good, that's good to know. I thought it was just in my day. They probably don't use an old VHS or something like that, just an old videotape. Okay, people would say, okay, I'll go. They don't have VHS. They don't have a digital. They don't have an iPhone. They're not recording it. They go to the theater, and then they remember it. Okay, they go home and they write it down, literally. Okay, and it's amazing. It's amazing. So Hamlet was published as what we now refer to as the bad quarto of Hamlet, was published kind of against the wishes of Shakespeare's production company by somebody who's bootlegging it from his memory, and goes home, watches Hamlet, goes home, writes it down, gets all the scenes right, says in terms of the structure of the scenes, who was in it, what happened. Most of the speech is pretty close, but there'd be small wording, you know, like you didn't memorize every word, you know. So here's an example of the bad quarto. Was the famous speech, to be or not to be, that is the question, right? People have heard that speech. Raise a show of hands, you've heard that speech, to be or not to be, right? I'm hoping everybody raises their hand in this one. To be or not to be? No one's ever heard that one? Okay, so a few people have raised their hand. Okay, good. Okay, everybody. Okay, good. Maybe it took some people a while to find the raise hand button. But yeah, so to be or not to be, that is the question. So we know, we've heard that a million times. And then in this one, the bad quarto, it is to be or not to be, that is the point. Okay, so but generally they got all the scenes, as I said, you know, and the speeches, and maybe mixed some words here and there. We our authoritative source for many of the plays, there's 36 plays there, and for many of them, the most authoritative source is this first folio. So it was published by close associates of Shakespeare after his death. So he died 1616. So 7 years afterwards, in this folio edition. So folio is usually reserved for something that is of high value. So folio means when they print, they take a piece of paper like this, and then they fold it once. That's a folio. So folios are large books because the sheets are bigger than this 8.5 by 11. So it's a large book because the pages have only been folded once, okay? Now, as I said, it was reserved for things such as the Bible, really, expensive learned texts. So already Shakespeare had gotten a fame as being this exceptional playwright. And people got together and said, we should put together his collected works into this folio. And this is, as I said, the most, luckily, because it's our authoritative source for many and our only source for some. We also have, in some cases, good quartos that were published during Shakespeare's life, based maybe on prompt books from the actors and other things like that. So a quarto, instead of being folded like this once, they take the pages and fold them one more time. So you get 4 leaves out of it, and then if you cut the bottom, you're going to get 4 leaves out of that one sheet. Okay, so a quarto. And then an octavo, you can probably do the math, is if it's folded again. Okay, so those are kind of some of our sources that someone that we have for Shakespeare's text. I want to emphasize almost all the plays, there's going to be differences in versions. Okay, so between, let's say, the quarto version and a folio version and this version, because of maybe different sources that were used. And then even in the folio, so the folio is maybe printed in different sequence. So there's, I forget how many copies of the folio are lying around, but there might be minor differences in this actual manuscript of the folio versus that one over there. Okay, so we have to be attentive to these textual changes or textual permutations. The other thing I'll just highlight here is collective writing is something that happens a lot. So as with film, I said there was, during production, maybe there'd be additions or changes to the play, and maybe there's some evidence that he may have collaborated with others for certain scenes, such as the witches scenes in Macbeth. So let a small puncture of the whole of that the body of Shakespeare's work is this kind of sacrosanct body of words that you can't change a word, and that is from this singular genius. Well, first of all, we don't know what those words are exactly in every case, right? So we have different sources. So the borders of that oeuvre are somewhat rough. And in some cases, particular scenes were probably co-authored, so it's not necessarily by this singular genius. Definitely Shakespeare whoever Shakespeare was a genius, but it's against, let's say, it's called bardolatry. So the bardolatry of worshiping Shakespeare is almost this superhuman genius, and revering the words as sacred words. Again, we're not quite sure are those the right words. Is maybe to be or not to be, that is the point. No other text has it, but that's what someone took away. So I want to end with a discussion of Shakespeare's genres. Okay, so I say Shakespeare's genres because the dramatic genres, as well, like tragedy, comedy, are as dramatic genres and as, let's say, modes more broadly can have different interpretations. But what follows here is, if we were to take Shakespeare's use of that genre, here seem to be some of the features that unite those plays or of that genre. So for instance, I'm starting with comedy. Aristophanean comedy, so ancient Greek playwright, okay, is largely focused on social issues, about the political issues, is about highlighting the hubris of, let's say, political figures or political castes or groups, and satirizing their blind spots. So it has, let's say, more of a political and almost a philosophical function of highlighting the limits of human knowledge when it comes to political affairs and our dealings with the world. Shakespeare's comedy is more narrowly focused, well, let's not say more narrowly focused, but is more focused on, let us say, the ordering of desire or love, okay? So eros. So it kind of is the logical extension of the sonnets that we were reading. So it's kind of a, the comedies are different ways of expressing some of the conventions you often see in the love sonnets, okay? So what happens in the kind of the social ordering of love or desire in the comedies, generally speaking, is, you know, it starts with a discord between an older world of adult authority figures. You see that in almost all the comedies. So there's they are parents of the young characters that are about to fall in love. They're parents, but they're also, let's say, community leaders. So you see this in Midsummer Night's Dream. So Theseus and Hippolyta, and the parents of the two groups of couples there. They're community figures. They represent the standards of the community, but those standards are hyper, let's say, reserved and static, and they don't allow for new growth, okay? They don't allow for, let's say, these young loves, okay? Now, but the young lovers, young love presents a danger to the community, though. So you can't have a social order, I guess. One way of thinking about it, the social order could be frayed if everyone was going around having sexual relations without regard to marriage and having kids, and then there'd be questions of, let's say, paternity of the children, and then there'd be questions of possession of the property, and so that it would intersect with what is the established rules of the social order, of the kind of the political rights of the social order, of possession rights, of what have you. Okay, so the old authority figures, so in Latin we have this term senex, so there's senex figures, so they're the old figures are the ones that are stifling, you know, they're like the old, they're like Footloose, you know, they're one that's you know, going way back now to an 80s movie there. So like these old people in the community that don't want to let the kids dance, you know. And then here they don't want these young lovers getting together and having, you know, getting together and having relations outside of marriage, and no, I've picked a different husband for you and all that good stuff. And then over here, these people are dangerous. So they have a perspective, the young figures have a perspective about love needing to, you know, I love this person and why won't daddy let me do that? And that's horrible. But they also pose a threat, and they need to, their behavior has to be curbed in some way. It's also in the comedies, love's also presented as a danger in the sense that it's often presented as fickle, and like Midsummer Night's Dream again is, and Two Gentlemen of Verona highlighted as a couple of comedies where that's particularly the case. So it has to be tried and tested, so to speak, whether it's real love or whether it's just kind of some spell from Puck the Fairy, you know, Midsummer Night's Dream, if you read that one. Is this kind of tried and true, or is it fleeting and fickle? And one of the ways it's tested are through certain ordeals that happen as the young couple has to flee the social order. So there's the city, there's the community, and they flee to basically what's called a green world. They go to the woods, they go to the forest of Arden in As You Like It. They go to, in that play, in Midsummer Night's Dream, they go to the forests outside of Athens, and there they get into all sorts of problems with confused identity, where they get into problems that need to be resolved, and that becomes the kind of the distance from the stifling social order that allows them to become themselves. They're finally, there's a resolution that brings them back into the social order, a social order that's renewed because it's got a new couple that will be married and will renew the social order because they're going to have lawful children in wedlock. And the couple is renewed because their love's been confirmed, it's been tested, and they've also, let's say, learned a lesson. So the comedies have this again, this social focus in terms of it's not about an individual, it's about the social directioning and channeling of what could be otherwise chaotic desire. So I make this note here that none of Shakespeare's comedies has an individual's name as the title. So it's always the social function, you know. So the Two Gentlemen of Verona, The Taming of the Shrew, which is a let's say a function, the shrew, a type within a relationship or social order, or the Merchant of Venice. So again, a socially focused role. Now, tragedy, on the other hand, deals with individuals in relation to their own fate or death, we could say. So the tragic individual, again, and I want to again say for Shakespeare. So tragedy, for let's say Greek tragedy or different theories of tragedy. Let's say Nietzsche had a theory of tragedy. Aristotle has you know, these figures have famous theories of tragedy. That would highlight slightly different features. But here I just want to highlight what we seem to see in Shakespeare, and to some extent you see the same things in Greek tragedy, but not always. The individual is one of an insight, let's say, has an insight into let's say a disorder in the cosmos beneath what is a seemingly ordered veneer. Okay, so the tragic arises, let's say, when the individual in this moment of insight, this capacity for insight into, let's say, the kind of chaos and meaninglessness behind the social veneer that we just described, that insight outstrips kind of our capacity, our human capacity to live without fiction. So my point of departure there is that, you know, we need to have, as humans, our kind of little fictions to live by, that, you know, when I say, you know, when the couple were reconnected to the community, that they will live happily ever after, you know, is a comedic resolution. Well, yeah, that's the fiction, right? They're not going to live happily ever after. They're not going to live happily every moment of the rest of their lives even, okay? So first of all, they're not going to live forever, and they're not going to be happy every moment of the rest of their lives. And the other person will probably at least look at other people. You know, they're human. You know, there's going to be human foibles in that relationship. So the insight into, let's say, the mere veneer that holds human relationships together, society together, that insight, and the insight into, let's say, whether it's an immorality that's behind, that can be behind human intentions or social arrangements, and let's say an insight into maybe a chaos that's at bottom of the cosmos. And you get this in Lear, you know, Lear raging in the heath, you know, in the storm, and that this is the cosmos, not this notion that there's this is the cosmic quote unquote order, is this storm, which is the same storm of wrath that I get from my daughters, and hatred and selfishness. This insight surpasses, let's say, the ability of the character of humans to live without fictions, let's say. Okay, so that's where we get this tragic kind of tension between what I see as potentially real about existence, about there's a kind of horror to existence, and yet I need kind of a soothing fiction. As opposed to the social focus of comedy, tragedies focused on the individual. So all the titles of Shakespeare's tragedies, and not every tragedy by other Renaissance playwrights is this the case for, but for him, every tragedy has an individual character as the title. I have a question on the essay. What time is the essay due tomorrow? It's due 5 p.m. So tomorrow, Friday, 5 p.m. Good question. Thank you. History. So in the folio, there were these three divisions: comedies, tragedies, histories. So histories deal with, for Shakespeare, their histories are about English history, okay? He takes a couple of sources, mostly this person named Holinshed as his source of, and the chronicles of English history that are there, and dramatizes them, okay? A lot of them have to do with this period called the War of the Roses. We talked a little bit about that. We talked about, what led up to the Tudor reign at the beginning of the 16th century. So this War of the Roses at the same time as the 100 Years' War with France. So in plays such as, there's a set of 3 plays about Henry VI, where England is plays this out, both war with France as well as kind of internecine War of the Roses. And Joan of Arc makes an appearance in, I believe, the second of the Henry VI plays, if I'm correct, either the first or the second. So these history plays deal again with the individual, but now the individual as a person of political action in the community. Okay, so it's related to the community, but it's not about the channeling of desire into a social function, but it's about kind of the individual as person of action leading the community in war. So it's usually king so and so is the title of the play. And one other thing is that Shakespeare's histories are unique in mixing or mingling kings and clowns. So Sidney, in his defense of poetry, had kind of warned against mingling kings and clowns. I don't mix comedy with this serious description of history. So relation of the genres. The 3 genres then, I think, imply one another. They point to one another in individual cases, and their boundaries are crossed. So comedy points to history in as much as it's about taking these, like, let's say, individual desire as disruptive, channeling it into a social order, which implies, okay, well, what is that social order and the good of that social order, and how is it preserved? And we see that in history. So we see, let's say, the social order and the dangers of that social order, how it can be riven by civil strife, etc. History then points to tragedy. So history, this person, reflecting on the historical order and the conflicts within the historical order, can then take maybe a tragic moment of insight outside of it. So I have a couple of questions here. One is about how to cite the sonnet, and the person says, sonnet 19, line 1 to 2, for example. Yes, that works. That's good. A question about, so Antony and Cleopatra is considered a tragedy, but it focuses on historical figures and threats of war. Does a play have to strictly fall under one genre, or can there be some overlap? Like, can we consider Antony and Cleopatra history plays? That's a really good question. So it's considered a tragedy for a couple of reasons. So in the folio, it's listed in that section of tragedies. I believe it is Tragedy of Antony and Cleopatra in the title. But mostly, but to answer your question, you're right. Like, so we have these categories, but there are, and this is what I'm trying to get at here, these are categories that there are for Shakespeare overlaps. They point to one another and they kind of bleed into one another, and depending on how one looks at them. And Antony and Cleopatra is at least somewhat history and somewhat tragedy, and it takes this space that, as we'll see in the, I think the next slide or one of the next slides. I'm just going to skip this slide, but if there's questions about that later, you can let me know. Called the Roman plays. So what technically the histories are, hopefully everyone can see this, and people's, we don't have faces over top of it, but the histories, so right here, and here are a few examples, there's others. So for each one of these slices of the pie, that it's not an exhaustive list of what goes there, but the histories are based on English history, but he also wrote what people often term these Roman plays. And Roman plays, in each case, in the folio, were grouped under the tragedies, but they seem to be a slightly different type of tragedy because, as Atifa pointed out, they deal with history. They deal with Roman history in this case. So they kind of occupy a space between, if we were to try to describe this, the Roman plays kind of occupy a space between history and tragedy. And then there's another category over here, often called the romances. They were written in late in his career. They have a lot of tragic overtones, but it doesn't have a tragic ending. There's kind of a comedic ending. And it has, usually it takes place over 20 years. There's a lost daughter. So it has these kind of medieval romance themes as well. So they're called the romance, and you could say it occupies this space between tragedy and comedy. And then I put the Henriade there, which is these set of plays on Henry IV and Henry V, which because of maybe, has anyone read Henry V or the first part of Henry IV? Has anyone read those in other contexts? So Atifa, someone's read that. So Falstaff, we see in Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2 a little bit. We see there very much this mixing and mingling of clowns and kings. So we see a mingling of the comedy in figures such as Falstaff and their interactions of what they bring, and the historical. So we get again a different kind of slice of the pie, so to speak. So I'm going to stop there. Any questions on Shakespeare's kind of a general introduction to Shakespeare's drama? Or we had a couple of questions on the essay, which is due tomorrow at 5. Okay, that being the case, I'm going to stop there, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Thank you.